Great, thank you Aya and thank you Torren. Do you know how many microservices there are needed to get a taxi to your door? Anyone? So when I picked up my phone this morning, of course we stayed at the wrong hotel, so we had to take a cab over here. We booked an Uber with the Uber app, and when doing so, it's actually 800 microservices that are being called before the Uber arrives at the hotel, which is really interesting, and I will get back to that fact later in this presentation about why that's so important. So I'm Peter. I've been working with content management for way too long, and my wife says, like, you should be doing something different, and probably I should. But I've been doing that for almost 20 years, and I come from the north of Sweden, so this is me picking cloudberries. I love snow, cold, and ice, and that's why I think I'm really, the same type of mood as all the people here today, right? At least that's how I look at Finnish people. It's pretty much the same as Swedish people, right? So I've been at Contentful for 5 years, and before that I was at a company called Episode, which is also inside the web content management space. But let's start with having a look at the history of CMS. I would guess that probably most of you have a good understanding of what a content management system is. But the development has gone from early 2000 when the web exploded, and the web content management system, of course, rise because we had to have a way to publish content to the web without having being a developer, right? So these content management systems were created. So they usually had a really good what you see is what you get type of editor. They had these publishing workflows and lots of other functionality around permissions. And as it grew, it also became localization to be able to work with different markets. But then in 2007, something really important happened. And that was Steve Jobs went on stage and he presented the iPhone. And all of a sudden, it was a completely different market landscape. So these CMSs that have been really focused on delivering content for the web, all of a sudden had to figure out how to also get content into mobile. And not only that, because also social channels started to rise. So more functionality were added to these CMSs to be able to also deliver content to these other places, right? And then around 2012, there was lots of focus around conversion. So people were starting to talk about these funnels, that you had to get your customers through the funnel. You need to do A/B testing. You need to have great analytics tied to it. You started connecting your CMS with your CRM. You started talking about the personalization and these type of things. So more and more functionality that were added to the CMSs. And then 2017, that's where everything was around the experience. So people were talking about customer experience. So how do we do one-on-one personalization and really following the customer in the customer journey? So this really led to that something that started off quite small 20 years ago grew into much more complicated and complex platform, which is now in many cases referred to as a digital experience platform. But most of the systems that are CMSs today or digital experience platform today, they were actually architectured in the beginning of 2000. So they're based on that architecture, which is also the reason why now Forrester says that it's the end of the CMS as we know it. And ThoughtWorks says that we've seen so many organizations run into trouble when they try to use the CMS as their digital platform. And what's the reason for this? So why doesn't what used to work in 2000 work now? And what has changed in the market and the landscape? And I really love this. So this is Dave Snowden, who worked at IBM. And he was doing research around complexity. And he came up with what he's referring to as the Sunna framework. So a way of looking at complexity. And it turns out that many of these systems, they work really good in the simple and the complicated quadrant, where we have a known correlation between cause and effect. So if we're doing something, we know what's going to happen, right? So there's usually, in the simple quadrant, you have a best practice. If we do this, we're going to be successful. And in the complicated quadrant, we know it's a good practice. We have a pretty good understanding what we need to do to become successful. But when you get to the complex quadrant, it gets interesting. Because this is pretty much what the world looks like today in digital. So many of the things that we're doing, the problems we're trying to solve, we don't really know how to solve them. And to be successful in this quadrant, you need different types of tools. And then, of course, Agile has been the way that companies and organizations have tried to tackle the complex quadrant. I have no idea if he survives. I hope so. So always improve, seize opportunities, and avoid danger. But how can we make sure that the technology also supports this? So how can we create good tools that are supporting us to tackle problems in the complex quadrant? And this is what I want to talk about today. So the new requirements of a content management system or a digital experience platform to be able to succeed in the complex quadrant. And I will talk about 4 different things. So the first thing being from tailor to teams. After that, from suites to stacks. And then from templates to blueprints. And from cope to co. So let's dive into the first one, from tailor to teams. And you know how it is in many classic organizations that it's the workers who execute and it's the leaders who manage. And this also works really well when you know exactly what to do. And it's been working in many industries, and it's following a model that Taylor came up with around, I think, 1930s or 1940s. Which was really a way of looking at how can we as a company, as a business, be as effective with our workforce as possible. So how can we have the right processes, and how can we really define what people should be focusing on to become effective? And this led to this model, which many companies are still using today, where you organize your workforce according to their specialists, like the marketers and the sales team, and then the developers, etc. They're organized in these, almost like these silos. But it turns out this model is not working well in the complex quadrants because there's so many bottlenecks when you don't know what to do. So these flows will become bottlenecks, and you will need to rework and go back and forth between these different departments. And that's why, of course, many organizations are now working in teams instead. So there's teams with a cross-functional setup that have a specific goal that they want to get to. So there's multiple specialists that's working together to solve specific problems. And this also means, in terms of tools that we need to support these teams, that they will also need to tackle this very differently. Because if you look at the old Taylor model, how you evaluate the software and what you want to use, you usually went to all the different departments and asked them, okay, so what do you need from this new system? And then you came up with a huge list, an RFP, which had all the features and the requirements that you wanted from the system. This works really well if you have a really good understanding of what you need. But once again, in the complex quadrant, you don't have that. So then for teams, there needs to be a completely different way of evaluating software, and they should be trying it out. So actually building something using that software, so a proof of concept, on a non-mission critical project usually, just to make sure it actually works. And what you're evaluating is not the specific features and functionality, it's much more how flexible that platform is, how fast can we move with it, how good is the support, how good is the documentation, also the soft aspects around it. And this is something that you can really evaluate if you do a proof of concept, but it's really hard to evaluate if you're using that RFP. And you've probably seen that Henrik Knieberg, one of the famous Agile persons, he has this really good illustration that, if you want to develop something that's going to take you from point A to point B, you shouldn't start with the foundation of a car. You should rather create a skateboard. So the skateboard is your proof of concept. So, to summarize, sometimes the only way to really know if something is successful is to try it, right? And that's something that these teams need to be enabled to do. So, short summary around teams and a little bit of a litmus test. You should be thinking about self-service rather than contact sales, which means that it should be really easy to sign up and try out the product without involving sales or having that slow process to actually get to try out the product. And it's much more important that it's working well than it's demoing well. A nice demo, anyone can do a good demo, except me, I'm really bad at giving demos. But you can be impressed and fooled by demos. It's much more important that it's actually working when you're hands-on with it. And these platforms will also need to focus more around the collaboration rather than specific workflows. Workflows are good, don't get me wrong. But many of these workflows that exist in CMSs and digital experience platforms are made for the tailor model and not the team model. Okay, so that was the first one, teams. Second one, suites or stacks. So what does that mean? How many of you own a KitchenAid? Are you from Sweden? No. You've been living in Stockholm? So when I moved to Stockholm, beginning 2000, this was like the machine you should have in your kitchen. If you didn't have that, like your friends would just shake their heads like, why don't you have the latest and coolest machine that you need to have? And when you're selling your apartment, there needs to be a picture of this one in your kitchen. It turns out, also talking to my friends, I did some research here that no one actually uses this machine. It's the best machine ever. It has all the different things. You can do everything with it, from whipped cream to work with your sourdoughs and all these things. But it turns out, this is a complicated machine. It takes time to actually, bring it up there, start, whipping your cream. You need to find the right part. It's too complicated. So you much rather, just pick the right tool for the job. And you can also work several people at the same time with these different tools. It's much easier to collaborate when you're making a dinner or you're baking bread. And this is pretty much also what's going on now in the technical landscape, that people are starting to figure out that these complex tools, sorry, I want to go back. There you go. These complex tools, they look so good on paper. They can do everything. But it turns out that in reality, they are just slow moving, and they might look good. They might be, a good thing to show to your friends, but they're not really, cutting it. So then coming back to the question I asked in the beginning, how many microservices are being called when you order a cab? And so Uber is one of these companies that were really early with moving into what's called a microservices architecture. And yes, they are quite extreme, so 800 microservices, that's a lot. But what we're seeing right now is that more and more companies are starting to prefer to have specialized services that are then instead working together to produce the outcomes that they want. So the advantage with this is, once again, that the teams can actually select the services that are working the best for them, and then they set it up into and create their digital experience platform based on those services. And the big advantage is also that if you don't like something, you can just remove that and try something else. You can also update these services individually, and this is the key aspect of being able to move fast. Because if you have one large platform, you have that one big KitchenAid, maintaining and serving that takes a long time, because you need to make sure that every change you're making will need to work with all the other things within that platform. Whereas if you're using specialized services, those are isolated, so they are decoupled, meaning that they can be updated individually, and therefore a small change will also be a small release, and not turning a small change into something that becomes a really big release that you need to test. And this is also something that's starting to show now in different surveys. So this is a report from Forrester on the state of digital experience. And if you compare how many companies that think is, what's most important is the ease of integration among front-end components versus, getting all components from a single vendor, you can see that the balance is really like, it's more important that these different services are working well together than it's all coming from the same vendor. And a study from Gartner showed the same. So this is marketers. So they asked marketers, what's more important for you? Getting everything in the same platform or using this best-of-breed approach? And you can see now, and this has also been changing quite a lot the last years, you can see right now it's 57% who prefer that best-of-breed approach. I'm not a big fan of the name best-of-breed because it sounds like you should be using the best system out there. You should be using what's best for your business. And that might be completely different from your competitor or from any other company. But making sure you're picking the services that are best for you and best for your teams. And something we're also seeing, and something that Gartner is highlighting in the latest experience wave, is that they see that the content platform or digital experience platform, rather than becoming that platform that contains everything, it should rather be the things that are connecting all your services in your digital stack. So everything around from translation, artificial intelligence, personalization, these things, all these things need content, and that's why the content platform becomes very important to be able to connect these other services. Okay, so what's the litmus test for stacks? So You should be looking at APIs over complex integrations. APIs will be the key for your service to be able to work with other services. APIs are the most important aspects there. Flexibility over out of the box. So don't look at does it contain this specific feature, but rather how long will it take for my team to create a specific new feature that we need, because you don't need what features you need tomorrow. And then last but not least, runs in the cloud or runs on the cloud. There's an important distinction here regarding things that are cloud native versus things that have been created for on-premise and is now running on top of the cloud. So cloud native products, they can scale in any way you want, but the one important thing is that they will always be up to date. You don't want to get stuck with a CMS or a digital experience platform where you have version 6.1 and you can't upgrade to version 6.3 because of something. You want to make sure that your digital stack is always up to date. So whenever there's a new feature released, you get that so you can try it out immediately. Very important. Okay, and the third one, from website templates to experience blueprints. And as you're probably aware of, most of the CMSs out there, they come with a set of templates which contains, on one hand, the presentation layer, maybe for your website. They usually contain some business logic and then some integrations. So they are very, they have a really big head. The presentation layer is usually referred to as the head. So they contain lots of functionality in the head. What you rather should be looking for is, having different services that are connected, but not so much what's actually inside the template. And the reason for that is that if you're working with a digital experience stack, it will be much more important for you to be able to launch new experiences and be able to scale experiences where you have these connected services rather than just to look at a specific website that you're creating right now. You will need to be able to scale it. So one specific website and one specific template will not be able to do that. And look at Lablo. So that's one of our Contentful customers. They say, we've been creating, the last 7 years, we've been building 9 digital experiences. But the coming 2 years, we need to create 150 more experiences. So there is definitely a big scale that's going to happen in terms of number of experiences. So you will need to have a really good architecture that can scale that. So that's why the blueprints will become so important when you're working with the stack. So you can select that, we are using this reference architecture, and then maybe you're bringing in a new service that you want to launch a new experience on top of. That should be really easy for you to do. So that will be the blueprint or connecting your different services that can immediately be launched for a new initiative in a new market or something similar. So scaling these experiences with blueprints will be a key thing for companies. And of course, working with DevOps practices. So how can you then not just create new experiences, but also update them fast? So we have customers today which are doing 10 deployments per day on their digital infrastructure. And that's moving really fast. So that means making content changes, content model changes, and code changes, and rolling that out to production. Because coming back to these experiments, that you don't really know what's working. So it will be so important for you to get something out there, try it out in a fail-safe environment, of course. See if it works. And if it doesn't, you can roll it back safely. I think she's good. Okay, so here's the blueprint or the litmus test for blueprints. And so you should be looking for modular and always up-to-date things rather than a monolithic solution that's trying to contain it all. So the way, how fast it is can be updated and it's modular, that's key here. Because you will want to do these small iterations to try it out, experiment, and learn all the time. And then, last but not least, these reusable integrations will be so much more important than a specific template that you have for a website. So the last requirement area I call from COPE to CO. So anyone know what COPE stands for? This is an old thing that all CMSs talked about for 15 years ago. Create once, publish everywhere. So this was the dream of all the CMSs. If we could just make sure that you can create it once and it makes available in all your different channels, you will live happily ever after. There's just one problem with this, is it was really hard. It turned out that on one hand, usually you didn't want to have the exact same content everywhere. It was a little bit different. And it turned out if you wanted just one content repository, that content repository became really complicated to support all your channels and all your needs. So in the same way that the technology platform grew very complex, your content repository and content model also grew very complex. And this led to something else, which I will get into a bit later. But that was a dream of create once, publish everywhere. So now organizations are rather talking about content operation. So content operation, you can say that's the definition of the processes and the people and the technology that you need to be able to, on one hand, think strategically about your content, be able to distribute it to the channels where you need it, and to be able to analyze it. So how can we do that effectively instead? That will be much more important for companies to figure out. So coming back to create once, publish everywhere, since it was really hard to create that one system that could really power all the channels, what happened was that you created silos instead. So you have these coupled solutions where you have your content repositories and you have your templates on top of it. And then you had your web channel and your mobile channel and maybe an app and maybe another website. And all of a sudden you have lots of different silos with different CMS installations to be able to support these multi-channel world. And I think it's important also to say when I'm talking channels, that might just be the web channel. You might have several different websites, and for me that's different channels, so different markets. And so the big change here is to think about the content separately from actually how you're presenting it and distributing it. And this will be very important for organizations that want to be effective with content operations. And instead of thinking about one big content repository that will solve it all, what we see is these organizations rather think in the same way they think about small services, they think about these smaller content repositories and how can we structure those to become effective with our content strategy. And to give you one example, to hopefully make it a bit clearer, and this is stolen from Mike Atherton and Karen Hain, like the different types of content that we're having. You can usually divide it into content that's not being changed that often, and that's content that's closely related to your domain. It might be your brand assets, it might be specific legal text, etc. And then you have content which is changing very often, and that's the content that's closer to the experience. That's the content you're A/B testing. That's the content that's usually personalizing and these things. But it's very different types of content. And usually what happens is that you will organize to make sure that teams, the legal team will have one repository where they can work with their content, which is not really dependent on how fast you want to work with content close to the experience. And this is really where content operations becomes really important. How can we also think about content in these different buckets? And when combining that, that's how we're building the experience. But the teams that are responsible for the different types of content, they can still move really fast without affecting the rest of the organization. So the litmus test around content operations will be to think about content without this head. So headless repositories over these couple solutions. And you should much rather think about atomic content than pages. So when working with a website, it's very easy to always think about pages and how you design in pages. But you will need to break that content down because that will be crucial when you want that content to live in different contexts and not just on that specific website. And then last but not least, design systems will be very important for you to have a consistent experience across all your different channels and websites. If you have that design system, then you're pretty much telling this is what the components should be looking like in these different channels rather than just focusing around the templates, for example, for your website. So that's how you can, once again, scale out your content operations. And I wanted to highlight a specific customer case which has been pretty much working with these 4 different aspects I've been talking about, and that's Bang Olufsen. So Bang Olufsen, they had a challenge, which I think is very similar to challenges many organizations have, that they wanted to meet the customers where they're at in this new complex world. But they don't really know what the customers want. So they want the system that's really flexible to be able to adhere to that. But they bought a monolithic platform which contains CMS and commerce, and they had a really hard time, doing exactly what they wanted. So actually, they had a different website for the product website where they talked about the product compared to where they were selling their product. And then they had the in-store kiosk. So in all the Bang & Olufsen stores, they also had the experience there, which was completely isolated once again from these two other websites. So really looking like the picture I showed earlier, like there were silos where they had the different content and the different website and how they presented it to their customers. So what they did was they selected to go with a digital stack instead, and they selected Contentful for content and commerce tools for e-commerce. And then they combined that, working once again with teams, with a small initial project, and they've been now scaling that out. And it's been really successful for them because now they can move much faster, they have a flexible system, and they have a consistent experience now across their websites. So it's just managed, once again with the content repositories that are feeding out to these different channels. So on one hand, in-store experiences, but then also their website where they are promoting their products and also selling their products today. So two websites turned into one, and now also the in-kiosk have the same experience as that website. And the results are pretty good. And we are quite proud of the sweet sound of omnichannel success, referring to Bang & Olufsen sound, So this is a catchy title. But I think it's really capturing on one hand, they were able to really increase their conversions and how they're selling their product. But everything is also so much faster. And this is another thing we're seeing among these customers which are going with the cloud native stack, that all of a sudden the experience becomes better because it's so much faster. It's loads faster. And I have another example because I had a prospect coming to me and said, like, you know what? We want a website that's equally fast as Daniel Wellington. Daniel Wellington is so fast. How can that be so fast? And I can't tell you, what technology Daniel Wellington is built on, but it's a really good technology and it's fast. But I think that's showing the expectation that customers have today. If they see a really good and fast experience, they want to have the same everywhere. And that's why organizations will start looking at, how are they able to create this really good experience? Okay, we want the same. But the key is really what I was talking about earlier, to summarize. That it's a new world we're living in. We are aware of that. I really like the Cinefin framework to highlight that it's in the complex quadrant, we need to work differently. And we will need to have tools that are focusing on teams, that works really great in the stack, that focusing on blueprints rather than templates, and can do content operations really well. Thank you.